All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our 1509th lecture.
Wow.
I'm Matt Van Valkenburg, the Secretary of Royal Asiatic Society of Korea. And on behalf of the officers and the council, I welcome you here tonight. By way of reminder, lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions and positions of Royal Asiatic Society of Korea. And RES Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, the Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. And we also especially thank Ms. Lee Jung-woo, who has made the use of the space at fast time possible. And it also helps if you renew your memberships or join. That's very helpful, which allows us to carry out these lecture programs. So we are joined tonight by Professor Susan Whitfield and Professor Simon Kainer. Professor Kainer is an archaeologist of early Japan and director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures at the University of East Anglia, Norwich in the United Kingdom. Professor Whitfield is a historian of medieval China and the Silk Roads. She's professor of Silk Road Studies at the Sainsbury Institute and was previously curator of the Dunhuang manuscripts at the British Library. Tonight, they will discuss the Nara to Norwich project, changing Buddhist landscapes, and the history and influence of the Silk Roads.
Not working. Your light's not working.
So start all over again. So after the lecture, there will be time for questions. So please welcome Professor Kainer, Professor Whitfield.
I'm going. If I speak like this, you can all hear me. Can you? No. Okay. I'll use mic then.
Okay, I'm trying. Wait, how did you hear that? Turning on and then turning off.
That sounds okay. Is that working now? I can't tell. Okay. Thank you very much. I should say we rather invited ourselves to this party because it's not working. Oh. Anything else we can do? It seems to be out of juice, really, I think. Do they have how do they charge up?
No idea.
Okay.
It works for 2 seconds and stop.
It's out of juice, so it's, yeah. It's not fully charged.
Can't hear, move closer.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not sure what else I can do. Yeah, no. Do you want to move up to the front, perhaps? Yeah. Yes, so we invited ourselves rather to this party because I'm a council member of the Royal Asiatic Society in London. And we're very much trying at the moment to build greater links with the societies, Royal Asiatic societies around the world, especially since we've just had our bicentennial in 2020. What are we now? 3. So we had lots of celebrations and exhibition for that, and we've been, as I said, trying to build up links with our organisations, sister organisations around the world. So it's a great pleasure to be able to come to Korea and speak to you because you've been going since 1900, yeah, which is a long time, and to come to a society I know nothing about. So I look forward to chatting to some of you later and learning more about it. But today we're going to introduce the project we've been working on since 2016, the Nara to Norwich project. This is about religions at the ends of the Silk Road, about Buddhism coming into Korea and Japan, and about Christianity going into Britain and Scandinavia, and how that affected all aspects of life, not just the art, the whole material culture, the practices of people, but also the landscapes. And Simon's going to talk more about that in his half. I'm just, as a Silk Road historian, I'm going to talk a bit about the Silk Road first, because it's widely used. Sorry, I've accidentally pressed several of these things without realizing. They're super sensitive. Oh dear. There we go. We'll go back to the beginning. It's a widely used but widely abused term. I mean, there's a lot of scope creep in it. I've been using the Silk Road shamelessly since the 1990s for books and exhibitions and all sorts of things. Can you increase volume? Okay. I can't speak much louder, can I? So I've been using the term shamelessly for a long, long time in books, as I said, and exhibitions. But I am very wary because there is a lot of scope creep and a lot of appropriation, if you like, of the term. And as you'll probably know, a lot of scholars have questioned about whether it's useful or whether it's just too broad and too nebulous a term to have any function. And so we have things like Indonesia's local coffee brand, the call of the Silk Road. Well, the Silk Road did not get to South America. Coffee was not part of the Silk Road. We're a pre-coffee era. It was not global. And of course, more recently, we have the Belt Road Initiative of the People's Republic of China, which has really tried to reinforce the narrative, if you like, I would say, of China owning the Silk Road and being responsible for it. And I've been doing quite a lot of work to question that and try to not let that narrative become too dominant. So yes, you get things like this, the Silk Road, globalization in the ancient times. Well, it wasn't globalization. This is a map of Asia, not even Europe or Africa, but Silk Road was Afro-Eurasian, but it wasn't global. It wasn't American. And this is an educational map. So run by, I think, put out by an American museum. I can't remember which one, but you get this a lot. At least Korea and Japan are mentioned. And then you get terrible maps like this. Sorry, it's very fuzzy as well, but look how misleading it is. And with spelling mistakes and this one single line that goes across as if there's a highway. You'll all be familiar with this. It's been discussed a lot. So I would say what the Silk Road is not, it's not dichotomous. It's not a binary. It's not a route between China and Rome. That's, you know, there was no direct contact for most of that period between China and Rome. That's not what the Silk Road's about. It's not east-west. And in fact, it's interesting. The Silk Road's become a big thing in UNESCO, cultural heritage over the past decades. And when it was first started to be talked about in terms of East and West, Nehru in India complained and tried to stop that term being used, East-West dichotomy, because he said it separates us rather than divides us. And I would agree, we mustn't look at it in dichotomous terms. It's not one way, one route. It's a myriad of routes changing over time by land and sea. The maritime route, it's not a separate network. It's part of the same network. You go from the Kushan Empire in Central Asia down the Indus River to Barbarican on the Indian Ocean. Then you go by sea to the east coast of Africa and by land again into trading posts in the East Coast. So it's, you know, it encompasses both. It's not just silk, but silk is important, and not just goods, and it's not, as I said, global. So I would say, if you had to have a definition, something like this: a messy, constantly evolving network of long distance trade, diplomatic, pilgrimage, military routes by land and sea across much of Afro-Eurasia in the first millennium AD and beyond. Well, you might well say, what distinguishes the Silk Road from what came before? Why the first millennium AD? Because we know there were contacts or certainly distributions of cultures and ideas, and long before this. I mean, if we look at the chariot with 2 horses. We find it in Scandinavian petroglyphs and in Shang burials in China from 1000 BC and before. So this is cultures that have moved from Mesopotamian, perhaps northern Mesopotamian home all the way across much of the Eurasian landmass. And there was trade long before, long distance trade. Tutankhamun's mask, famous iconic piece, is inset with jade, not jade, lapis. And lapis, of course, comes from eastern Afghanistan, from Badakhshan. That's the main mine and remains the main mine for lapis. There are some other sources, but most of lapis in the world, especially in this early world, comes from Afghanistan. So, and here's a miner today. You can see he's got his rock of lapis on his back. It's very difficult to access mines. I don't know whether any of you have been there, but it's really difficult place deep in the mountains, and it's snowed over for most of the year. So you can only get lapis out at some points of the year. But you can see this has been going on for 5,000 years, and lapis has been moved around the world because it's so rare and was appreciated by many societies. But this is long distance trade. So we're seeing lapis come from eastern Afghanistan, the blue lot, and going to Egypt. I should also say that something just as an aside, really, Tutankhamun's mask is partially lapis, but quite a lot of the blue in there is actually glass. And it's glass being used to replicate lapis. And we see that a lot in early glass being used to replicate semi-precious stones. But interestingly, glass, which was made in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, blue glass beads from there are also found in Danish burials in 600 BC, way before the Silk Road. So we're seeing trade to Europe and contacts to Europe at that time. But, so this is 4,000 miles from Central Asia to Egypt. At the same time, we have jade, which is mined and taken from the river in a place called Khotan, on the southern Taklamakan in the Tarim Basin, being sent to China and being used for burial goods and for other goods, high status goods, 4,000 miles to the east. So we see this long distance trade long before the Silk Road. So what distinguishes the Silk Road? Well, what is between that green and blue dot are high mountains. I'm sure some of you must have been there. To that part of the world, some of the highest mountain ranges in the world. And there's me on top of the dark cut glass here, just to show something of the scenery. This is not stuff you just trip along with your goods, stuck on the back of your camel or donkey or whatever. It's logistically very difficult territory. And to travel through logistically difficult territory regularly requires stability. It requires a stable government who maintain and look after roads and keep the peace and stop bandits and all those things. I mean, that hasn't changed. Trade requires a certain sort of stability. And that stability doesn't come with the Han Empire expanding outwards, which is a narrative that's usually given, with Jiang Qian in the 2nd century BC being sent to the Western regions. Actually, he was sent on a military mission, but coming back with lots of information, and the Han then expanding outwards. Sure, that happens, but they expand outwards and they're able to go across this route because in the 1st century BC, AD, we have the rise of the Kushan Empire, precisely over that central mountainous region. So Khotan and the lapis mines, if you like, are able to be joined, and it becomes a lot easier, a lot more possible and feasible to go across that Central Asian mountain massif. And this really enables China to the east and all the empires to the west and south and north, kingdoms and empires, to start trading more regularly across these routes. And it's that I think forms the start of the Silk Road. It's more sustained and regular medium and long distance contacts across Central Asia that reach out, of course, to the edges of Eurasia and Africa as well. Oh, I should just also say about that. Of course, this also controlled the routes down to the sea through the Indus River and the Indian Ocean, which also was a resulted in a lot of trade. Now, so the narrative of China being responsible for the Silk Road and the Silk Road emanating, if you like, outwards from China is a very misleading one, and only one that's, of course, being reinforced not just by scholarship, but by politics and economics. And it's interesting, I've been doing a bit of work recently looking at narratives, Silk Road narratives in Japan and Korea, which are really trying to find alternative narratives to this Sino-centric one and push for direct, for example, in Korea, as I'm sure many of you know, the routes across the steppe from Korea directly to Persia, bypassing China, have been emphasized quite a long time, especially with some of the finds, so grave finds that resemble things like the crown, that resemble those from Tilla Tepe. But it's becoming, I would say, more common and more strongly argued, this idea of alternative routes, both by land and sea. So routes across through the sea all the way to West Asia, to Persia, bypassing China and that's a result of course, China's position today and their attempt to really own the Silk Road. Now, the steppe culture is certainly also a very important part. I've said about the sea routes and the river routes, but the route across the northern steppe is also essential and very influential on Korea. So the narrative of the Silk Road is changing and has changed during my time as a scholar. And it's becoming, I would say, a lot more, at the same time as the Silk Road is being appropriated as a term in cultural heritage, but in advertising and that sort of in different world, and becoming more crude, if you like, in crudely used in that world. In the scholarly world, I think it's becoming more subtly defined, and people are realizing it's not so straightforward. So there is more discussion of the Silk Road and its complexity. Now, there's also a lot of discussion, of course, about whether silk is really an appropriate name, whether it should be the Silk Road or whether it should be the Paper Road or something else road. Well, lots and lots and lots of things were sent across the Silk Road, you know, fruits, animals, semi-precious stones, all sorts of things, anything you think of really that was valued by people. But silk does tell the story of the first millennium, because it's during that period that, because of this opening out of the routes across Central Asia, the mountain routes here, the silk sericulture, not just finished silk and silk thread, but sericulture, the raising of domesticated silkworms and using them to create thread, became spread gradually during the first millennium all the way across to, and sorry, that last image, everything's been moved across a bit. The last image, this one, should be in southern Spain, because by about 1000 AD, we're getting sericulture in Spain. So it is a sort of, I think, an okay term. But of course, silk's not just about sericulture, it's also about the patterns you use on it. And not everything went from east to west. So if we look at the second piece here, which is a child's silk jacket, about the 6th, 7th century, it's in Cleveland Art Museum. You can see this very distinctive pattern on it, which is called the pearl roundel. It has animals inside. And then you see it used with a simurgh, a Persian animal, mythical animal on the next piece. And then again, in this Byzantine piece made in Constantinople with the royal hunters, but again inside a circle with floral patterns in this case. And then the two peacocks sort of echoing that design. But this design was probably formed in Sogdiana, where you see the child's coat in what is now Samarkand, Uzbekistan, the great merchants of the Silk Road, the Sogdians. And the design traveled west, but it also traveled eastward. So it wasn't just a one-way travel. The sericulture traveled westward, but lots of other things traveled eastward and north and south. Just a thing about sericulture. Have any of you ever raised silkworms? It's funny, audiences, you know, where I go in the world, there's certain audiences that do. If I go to Germany, quite a lot of people have raised silkworms. Of course, of a generation during the Second World War, people had silkworms to make parachute silk for the war effort. But so quite often I'll get an old lady or old gentleman saying, oh yeah, I remember we had silkworms in our loft. But anyway, raising silkworms is hard work. The domesticated silkworm, which you see, or the domesticated moth, which you see up here, Bombyx mori on the top left, that's his wild cousin. And like all domesticated animals, cats, dogs, cattle, whatever, we've bred them to make them useful for us. And in doing so, they've lost a lot of their use for them. So a domesticated moth actually can't eat or fly. Its only purpose is the few that are allowed to hatch from the cocoon is to breed and produce more eggs for the next generation of silkworms. And eggs hatch and you get little silkworms like this. This is American dime. And then within 5 weeks after eating constantly, they become like this. They increase enormously. So you need a lot of food for them. They're like babies. They just eat and poop 24 hours a day, though. And so where are they looked after usually? Well, in a domestic setting. And this has been the case worldwide. Whenever silk, I mean, James I in England tried to get a silk industry, and it was just failed due to various reasons. But one of the reasons was that they weren't looked after properly. They thought that you could have a factory and leave them at night to look after themselves or whatever. It just doesn't work. They die at the slightest provocation. I mean, a draft, you shout at them. They won't go across. You have to chop up the mulberry leaves and put them underneath them next to their food because they won't actually move across to eat a mulberry leaf. They're just really great, big, inert, fat, bloated things that are there to produce a cocoon to give us silk. And it is quite, in a way, it's surprising that silk traveled at all, that sericulture traveled at all, because it is a complex, difficult process. And quite regularly, a whole colony of silkworms will die and you have to get another one in from somewhere else. They have no biological defense because they're too overbred. But this thing of the putting them in the domestic settings, so you see the babies and you see all the silkworms being looked after, this we find across, this is a Japanese print from the early 20th century, exactly the same thing, all these silkworms and the women chopping the leaves to feed them. And the only successful silk industry we've ever had in England was because it was done in somebody's stately home with all the local ladies from the village coming to look after the silkworms. And here's one, oh, sorry, I keep accidentally pressing them. This is Luddingston Castle in the 60s and 70s. That silk industry is now finished, but it was successful because, as I said, it was in the domestic setting. So it's surprising in a way, as I said, that silk traveled at all, because it is very, very difficult. It traveled because of the opening up of these routes and more contact between people who then found out more about silk and wanted to have this wonderful material. It is a fantastic material. a myth you will often get told, or will be told in practically every book about the Silk Road, is that the Chinese government tried to keep the secret of silk as a and not let it slip out to their neighbors. In fact, there's no evidence for that at all, and all the evidence we have shows that, in fact, the Han and other subsequent kingdoms and dynasties would send experienced silk people out to neighboring kingdoms to teach them about sericulture. So they weren't holding in this idea at all. But you get the myth of the Silk Princess, for example, who's sent to marry the king of Khotan, the place of jade in Central Asia, who is told by the king's aide that they haven't got silk in their country and she'll have to wear wool or all these other things. And she's so horrified that she smuggles out the cocoons in her headdress. But this is just nice stories. It's a complete myth. So, but practically every book you read will have that in. Now, just to whiz on, because I don't want to take away from Simon's time. Silk, apart from the raising of the silkworms, the weaving of the silk is, again, very complex, because silk, from a single cocoon, do you know how much length of filament you get from a single cocoon of a silkworm?
1 meter, Bob.
One?
1 meter.
1 meter. A kilometer.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. A kilometer.
I stuttered because I'm an American and so the metric system was, but I was on the
Yeah. So a kilometer of silk, a kilometer of filament. You have to then twist a few filaments together to get silk thread, but it's a lot, you know. It's incredibly strong. And if you think of all the other materials being used, threads being used in the world at that time, whether they're wool or linen or cotton, you have to spin them. And there's short pieces that have to be spun to create a thread, and therefore they have much less strength. And that means that most looms in the rest of the world were built for these threads, and the pattern was put on the width on the weft because the threads weren't strong enough on the warp to take it. In China, because of silk, the warp thread was perfectly strong enough to take a warp pattern. And so the looms built were for warp patterns loom. So you have two different sorts of technology. And not only when a new, a material spreads, that it's expensive and difficult to change a whole technology. It's not a straightforward thing. Question from the floor.
I have to, my ignorance is probably definitely. But how, so you make the silkworms, make the and then you harvest the threads from the cocoon to make a kilometer of silk from one.
Well, no, you have several cocoons and you twist several filaments from each cocoon together. So a thread of silk will be a few, 3 or 4 twisted. But even so, it's, because it's just too thin. So you'll twist several, slightly twist, but it does mean it's long and strong. And so the whole technology is different. I just put this slide in because there was little understanding of this textual evidence, but very little archaeological evidence of what looms were like in the start of the Silk Road. And this is a tomb from the 2nd century BC from a woman weaver, Mrs. Wong, who lives in Sichuan in the southwest, which was a big silk weaving area. And she runs her own weaving studio. And this is her grave. And she's buried along with scale models of all her looms and her loom workers, wooden models who have their names across, so that she can go in the afterlife and carry on her weaving business with these model looms and wooden workers. But this is the first sort of substantial, complete find we've had of a loom, pattern loom from that period. 2nd century BC. And it shows the sophistication, even of that time, of the loom. So it wasn't just a case of sericulture going across and you have silk thread and you can immediately use it. You have to think about the technology you've got to enable you to weave the material and create material. A pattern loom like this, and there's a scale, a model made of it by the National Silk Museum in Hangzhou. I mean, a full-scale working model made of the tomb, produces something like this. This is an armband to show rank, found in Central Asia, but woven in central China from 3rd, 4th centuries. And so it's little, that's what I'm saying. It's only, you know, sorry, there isn't a scale on it. And 5 colors, pattern on the warp. How many threads do you think, warp threads, there were per centimeter? 100, good guess. Any others? Any advances on 100? No? Okay, 220. Yeah. So per centimeter, 220 silk threads. I mean, the sophistication of the weaving of the looms at that time in China was astounding, really, enabling them to weave things like this. So just very briefly, because I want to pass on, we do see silk technology, both the sericulture, the raising of silkworms, the loom, but loom stayed. Most silks woven outside China were weft, still weft woven silks, because that's the technology they had. The patterns and the materials traveling all the way to southern Spain during that first 1,000 years AD. So I think the Silk Road is a perfectly reasonable name. Put in this slide, this is apparently the oldest white mulberry tree in Korea. Do any of you here know about I'm trying to do more work on sericulture in Korea, but I'm finding it very difficult to find reliable and good sources about it. So if anybody knows anything, please just email me. Anyway, this is a white mulberry tree, Sejong, which apparently is your oldest tree, 300 years old. So just to whiz through. Of course, we always think of silk from China, but there were other silk producers. So Indian textiles were probably immensely important as well in this story. The trouble is with Indian textiles is that all the ones in India have disappeared because of the climate from that period. You know, no textiles left because it's just, we have some Indian textiles or textiles made in India in the Taklamakan Desert in Central Asia. And also in Antinopolis in northern Egypt from the Silk Road period. But it's quite difficult to piece together the story from the pieces we have. These are just 2 interesting pieces because these were wall paintings from the 5th century found by recent Sino-French excavations at Caradong in the Taklamakan. And you can see these 2 Buddhas are wearing, this one's wearing a red gown, this one a blue, with resist-dyed patterning. Resist-dyed patterning was probably a technique that came from India to the Silk Road. And these were probably originally cotton made in India, but they came to Central Asia, and we, at the same site, were found these 2 pieces of silk, which replicate the patterns found on the painting. And they're interesting because they're probably locally made because they're not continuous silk. If you have your cocoon, which your worm has woven to turn into a moth, and you don't let the moth hatch on the hole. You throw the cocoon into hot water so that it doesn't break or distort the silk, and then you unwind it so the moth dies inside the cocoon. In a lot of Buddhist cultures, or maybe for other reasons, the thought of taking the worm's life was not so accepted, or there might have been other reasons, but you get broken or distorted cocoons, so the moth was allowed to hatch, and then you use the cocoon, silk from the cocoon, which had been either broken or distorted by the moth's hatching. And these are both made from discontinuous silk like that. It's less strong, obviously, but still pretty good. So these are almost certainly Indian influenced patterns, creating locally made silks from that period. Now, let me see, what have we got? And I'm going to whiz through now to end, so I can let Simon talk a bit more about the project. But as I said, the Kushan Empire, which united this area in the 1st century AD, was, I think, the most important catalyst for the start of the Silk Road in providing the stability. What it also did, of course, was enable Buddhism to move across. Buddhism had started to move before this, but it really moved further westward and into China, of course, Korea and Japan, and then across through Southeast Asia and everything during this period. And the Kushan were important in that process as well. And that was very much part of the landscape of the Silk Road, was this Buddhist culture moving eastward, and also with a Christian culture moving westward in the other direction in the pre-Islamic period. So you see, oh, sorry, that's really fuzzy, but, you know, the landscape changes dramatically. So in China and here, and you get new art, new forms, pensive bodhisattva, of course, new literature, new texts, the start of printing to disseminate the Buddha's work. So there's really, it's just like an exponential thing. You get this greater contact, and that results in a whole lot of changes, major changes in the cultures, including Korean culture of this world. And this is something we've been looking at really in the project Nara to Norwich, which has been going on since 2016. We have a website which will be completed when I get back to England. In the next few weeks. It's 2/3 there, so we're almost there. And we've got a small exhibition coming up, which is looking at the results of our research over the past 8 years. And this is just a couple of the exhibition panels talking about objects that traveled. So we have the relic glass jar here on the left from Korea that was probably made in, possibly the glass was made in Germany, or certainly a great deal to the further to the west, and other things like agar wood, incense wood coming from Southeast Asia. So you see a whole really dramatic shift in people's lives and in the landscape that they're surrounded with, in both their tangible and their intangible culture. A lot of this, since we've got archaeologists among us today, is a result of archaeology over the past couple of 100 years. And we also discuss this, including, of course, the growing field of maritime archaeology, which is really throwing up some very interesting finds for the Silk Road. And we were actually in the Maritime Museum down in Mokpo last week or earlier this week. And absolutely fascinating maritime archaeology being done here in Korea, which is, I think, going to transform our scholarly understanding of these routes. And yes, what this means is that both in Britain, where we have the Trumpington Cross with garnets, possibly from South Asia, and metal work that's from the steppe, and here in Korea, you have this wonderful dagger, again, with steppe and Caucasian influences. We both share influences across the Silk Roads and because of the Silk Roads at that time. And that's something we're really trying to explore and get across in this project. So as I said, that's all what I'm going to say. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Simon, who's going to talk to you more about all these things. Thank you.
Thank you. I couldn't help notice the slide of the lady growing silkworms in Lullingstone. She had an amazing hairdo. I thought, wouldn't that be perfect for smuggling silkworms, just like the legendary Chinese princess? They say the Chinese princess story is a myth. Yes, it's not. Yes, it is a myth. That wasn't really happening. Okay, lovely. I'll just put this on here. I can do one thing at a time. going to blame the jet lag. It's the incompetence, actually. Yeah, that's it. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Simon Kaner from the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures in the east of England, in Norfolk. I'm going to pick up the story and tell you a little bit about our project, which we call Nara to Norwich. And originally it was called Nara to Norwich, Art and Belief at the Ends of the Silk Roads. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and just give you a little tiny bit of the background. But as Susan said, we do have an online exhibition, which is now very nearly complete. It's kind of been an iterative process developing that. And that's at nara2norwich.org, if anybody is interested in following up on that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to this project, why a Japanese research institute in the east of England is looking at the Silk Roads, and just give you some of the justifications behind that and take you through a little bit of the process that we've been going through. This is our project timeline. As Sue said, we really started back in 2016. We had an international workshop in Norwich in 2017, and we've been building a new international research network, I suppose, and we've been delighted by the way that that's developed. And this evening we have with us Professor Susan Whitfield from Seoul National University, who's been giving us great insights into not only early Buddhism in Korea, but Professor Whitfield is a great specialist on early Buddhism in Gandhara. So very much that sort of Silk Road story there. And we have Professor Neil Price with us from the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And Neil is a great specialist on Vikings, and is very interested at the moment in the eastward reach of the whole Viking phenomenon. We have a group now of about 10, 15 international scholars who we've been able to bring together through a series of traveling workshops. We've been to Korea. This is actually our second trip to Korea. We were here in the summer of 2019. Last year we were in Istanbul in Turkey, talking to Turkish colleagues who are very interested in Eastern connections along the Silk Road. And as Susan said, this month, we're bringing together some of our results in a little exhibition that I'll talk about in a little bit. Oh, this is us in Sweden in summer of 2022, when we were visiting some of the Viking sites and other associated sites, which have been producing some very interesting things that are related to the Silk Road that I'll talk about. In our exhibition, we've got a number of different themes that we've been looking at. We've been looking at origins, the origins of Christianity and Buddhism, and trying to understand the ways in which both of those world religions made use of silk and other materials early on. We've been looking at encounters with other sacred traditions. So we're looking at the extremities of the Silk Roads. We're particularly looking at the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago in East Asia. And we're also looking at around the North Sea, so including Sweden and the east of England at the other end of the Silk Road. So that's our contention, that we can extend, if you like, pre-existing notions of what the Silk Roads actually are. We've been looking at questions of what happens with all these new lifestyles associated with those religions, in particular around monasticism. We've been looking at questions around pilgrimage. Obviously, along the Silk Roads, transport is very important. Susan's already mentioned the tremendous interest we have in maritime archaeology, or all these amazing wreck sites in season. Indeed, the visit to Mokpo and seeing the Sinam ship there was incredible. I'm particularly interested in burial mounds. I'm an archaeologist, and I've been aware of the great burial mound tradition in Japan for a long time. And of course, here in Korea, we've had a wonderful time over the last week looking at an extraordinary selection of burial mounds. And we're aware that in both Peninsular East Asia and around the North Sea, around this time, associated with both Christianity and Buddhism, people stop being buried in burial mounds and they start being buried in either churches or temples. And that's a shift in monumentality, as well as a shift in the way that people are seeing the afterlife. And then there's some exotica, which I think really first piqued our imaginations. And this is our traveling workshop that we're halfway through this time. We're nearly then. Tomorrow we head down to Gyeongju for a last couple of days there. Along the way, we found, I think in particular, following on from the COVID pandemic, this was all originally conceived of as an exhibition in my university art museum, the Sainsbury Centre. Those plans, it was supposed to be in association with the Olympics in Tokyo, but of course the COVID-19 came along and all those plans got shelved. But we already had our research network in place. We'd already done a lot of the research. And we found subsequent, or even during the pandemic and subsequent to it, we've been able to keep up all sorts of activities. This was the first time that the Kyoto National Museum has worked with another international organization to host an international symposium. And this was on the question of the forgeries from the Dunhuang caves, of which Susan is a great expert. And I believe we had an enormous number of people join this online in the middle of the pandemic. So I was sitting in my kitchen in Cambridge, and Susan was in London, and we had an audience in Korea and Japan, which was all rather wonderful. This is my institute. As I say, we're right in the, that actually says the British city closest to Japan. I guess it's possibly also the British city closest to Korea, I'm not quite sure. And we're right over in the east of England. We're right next to this thing, which is Norwich Cathedral, the 11th century cathedral. And we work on all different aspects of Japanese arts and cultures, in particular trying to understand the way that Japan relates to the rest of the world. And so the Silk Roads has been a really convenient mechanism for that, in particular because in Japan, the eastern terminus of the Silk Roads is regarded as being the 8th century imperial treasury, the Shosoin treasury in the Todaiji temple in Nara, which contains many treasures from along the Silk Roads. Pilgrimage is something that we've been long interested in. Norwich has always intrigued me. We're actually very close to this place, a place called Walsingham, which is the second most important pilgrimage centre in England in medieval times, and now again in the 20th and 21st centuries. It attracts very large numbers of pilgrims. And one of the questions that we've been asking is, what was the importance of the spread of religion in terms of spreading ideas and commodities along the Silk Roads? And there were striking parallels that we've been finding both in early Christianity and early Buddhism in regard to that question. And having Walsingham up the road has been a great inspiration there. This is my university, the University of East Anglia. This is the Sainsbury Centre, the art museum, where we were hoping to host our exhibition, but which didn't happen. However, in that art museum, there are some, as I said, this is for us or for a Norfolk audience, some relatively exotic pieces, which we felt had always been rather under-researched. The Sainsbury family had acquired a number of significant pieces of Japanese Buddhist art, including this piece, which may be as early as the 7th or 8th century, if it's authentic. And we're doing some background research into that just to know. But there are other fine Buddhist pieces as well. And we wanted to be able to explain this to our Norfolk audiences. So we were looking for hooks just to try and make this material a little bit more accessible to them. And our project has been helping us do that. So here it is. This is the things that here we are over in Nara, connecting up to what's happening in Norwich. So we're sort of just trying to expand people's minds a little bit, and also thinking about, especially in the post-pandemic situation, how we can use ideas like this to try and re-establish somewhat fractured networks. We all had to stay at home for those extended periods, and it was amazing just how much impact. I think we still don't necessarily quite understand how much impact that has had on the research communities and on our students, all sorts of people. So we're hoping that this is a way of starting to get over that. I think that our little bodhisattva head is possibly akin to the 100 or so small Buddha figures which are now in the Tokyo National Museum, which were donated by the temple of Horyuji in Nara to the imperial household collections at the end of the 19th century. So maybe it looks like, I don't know if any of you have seen the Horyuji treasures displayed in the Tokyo National Museum, but it's a rather wonderful sort of a universe, I suppose, of Buddhist figures, and we like to think of ours in there. And maybe it was akin to objects such as this, and of course we've been seeing things like this in the museums here in Korea. And one of the questions for me is this object, although in our museum collection it says Japanese, it's quite likely, if it is authentic, that it was made in Korea or in China. And just getting people to understand how those relationships worked in antiquity is something which we're exploring as well. Now, there are other really extraordinary finds which have fired up our imagination, in particular this one. This is a small Buddha figure, probably made, we think, in northern Pakistan, in the Swat Valley, perhaps in the 6th century AD. By the 8th century AD, this thing has arrived in what is now Sweden. And it was excavated from a Viking period settlement, from a house there where it was with some other materials as well. The Helior Buddha, now on display at the Swedish Historical Museum. And one of my colleagues went to see an exhibition about the Silk Roads in Sweden, and there was this thing, came back full of excitement saying, Simon, we really need to understand more about this. It was found in 1953. So it's not a new discovery, but we're hoping that some of our work will be casting light on that. In addition to discoveries of silk in Viking period and pre-Viking period graves in Sweden, also sort of fired up our imaginations, and we were able to see some of this thanks to Neil Price and his colleagues in Sweden. And then at the other end of East Asia, we've been sort of very interested in the connections between the Korean Peninsula and what's happening in Japan between the sort of the 5th to the 9th centuries. And we know all the interactions, of course, between these the kingdoms of Pekje and Shilla and Goguryeo, and what's happening in Japan, in Yamato Japan at that time. As an undergraduate student, I had to study all of this stuff from a great remove, and it was very difficult to try and imagine what was actually going on. So this has been a great opportunity to re-engage with those kind of questions, to revisit places like Horyuji, some of the oldest wooden buildings in the world, extending back to the 8th century, and to really get into some of the detail, the complex history of these kind of monuments, both in Korea and in Japan. As I said, we're very interested in these burial mounds. We've been doing some work on this Fujinoki mound, which is sort of late 6th, early 7th century, one of the best preserved mounds. Here we all are visiting the mound. They actually took us right into the stone chamber. And of course, you've got wonderful sites that are very, very similar to this in Korea. So understanding those relationships is key. One of the best preserved Japanese kofen excavated in recent years in the 1980s. I think is over 2,000 objects were recovered from the stone sarcophagus there. Just a little list of the things there, including things like glass beads, which Susan was talking about the glass. So we're finding these materials which are influenced by the Silk Roads, even in the burials of this period. And some material which is, of course, so very similar, very familiar to you from a Korean context. We've been in the National Museum today, I've been drooling over those gold crowns and the horse trappings, the saddles. This is all stuff from the Fujinoki tomb. It's so similar to what we find in Korea. Interestingly, in particular, the saddle has been Carl Gellert at the University of Berkeley has done a very fine PhD on this. A lot of the iconography on this is very exotic. There's elephants on there. There are lotuses, all sorts of really interesting things, which again speak to continental connections from the Japanese archipelago at this time. And there's silk in these tombs as well. So we know by this period, silk sericulture has already arrived in Japan and is quite important. At the other end of Eurasia, in our part of the world, we've kind of adopted the neighboring county of Suffolk as part of our project. There's a site called Sutton Hoo, which is exactly contemporary with Fujinoki and many of the tombs here in Korea. This is the Sutton Hoo 7th century royal burial ground. And we were talking to Professor Ree over dinner about a film that was made during the pandemic called The Dig, featuring Ralph Fiennes, and this is the site which was featured in that. And in particular, Mound 1, just here, was a site that was excavated in 1938 and 1939. And beneath that mound was found this amazing ship burial. Inside the ship itself didn't survive. It was just marks left in the sandy soil, and a number of rivets were found as well. And inside the ship was an amazing amount of treasure, with armor, with shields, with weapons, with musical instruments, and a lot of materials that had come from the European continent, and in fact, garnets and things which had probably come from South Asia, again, using those Silk Road connections. Reconstructed to look like this, and some very fine gold and garnet jewelry, some of the finest materials from this period known in England, now on display in the British Museum. And some rather wonderful silver pieces which we think were also coming from Europe, perhaps as far away as Byzantium, with Christian motifs on them, although this is a pre-Christian burial. We think it may be associated with a king called Redwald. I'll talk about it again in a second or two. And there are textiles from this tomb as well. And there is, I'm thinking this has never been properly analysed, and we're hoping that as part of our project, we can really get a sense of, was there any silk buried with this very important burial at Sutton Hoo? These wonderful golden garnet, this is a purse clasp. And when we had Professor Chris Scull, one of the great experts, and this Anglo-Saxon material came to Korea with us in 2019. And when he saw this in Gyeongju, he said, "Simon, why don't I already know about this?" We said, "Well, you're here now informing yourself." And so I think we're finding that there are many interesting connections between our scholars as well as the material culture. And there's recent work happening at Sutton Hoo at the moment, and with descriptions of some of the textiles that have been coming out. It's more likely to be linen and wool than silk at the moment, I think, but we'll wait to see what future research reveals about that. As I said, there's this King Redwald who's mentioned in, it's not on there, there's an 8th century, one of the earliest English histories we've got by a man called Bede, the Venerable Bede, who was a monk living up in the north of England. And in the 7th century, late 7th century, he wrote a book called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And he talks about a place called Rendlesham, which is very close to Sutton Hoo. And there's an ongoing project led by Chris Scull and other colleagues, where they have now recovered the royal centre, probably associated with that burial site at Sutton Hoo, which is about 10 miles down the road. So this has been very interesting. And this is also producing a lot of materials which have been imported from the continent, showing how very important those international connections were at this western extremity of the Silk Road. And just to finish off, hopefully we're, not too bad at all. Susan touched on this theme that we've got of what we call landscapes of conversion. And one of the research questions, one of the big research questions that I've become very interested in, is the ways in which both Christianity and Buddhism transformed the landscapes in which they were adopted. People started building churches and temples. They were using both Christianity and Buddhism to formulate the notion of the state, and those religions were being instrumentalized, I suppose, to legitimate the new power structures that were developing both in Korea and Japan and in around the North Sea at this time. And what I'd wanted to do, I've been looking at this material for a number of years, and I go and visit sites like Asuka in Japan, or looking around the sites of Paekche in Korea. And I've always found it difficult in my head to sort of visualize what those landscapes look like. And we've now got tools with geographical information systems. We've got amazing aerial photographs. We've got all sorts of ways of starting to allow us to reconstruct the landscape histories around these sites using good landscape archaeological techniques. This is This is around Rendlesham and Sutton Hoo. This is the Asker region. We've been plotting these sites and trying to understand how the landscape was developing around there, why these sites, why these burial mounds are where they are, why the Asker capitals are where they are, and what impact Buddhism and the Silk Road connections had on that. And we're very interested in looking at the Korean sites as well. And at the moment, I'm thinking maybe it should be the sites of Paekche, because as of course, I'm sure you all know, Buddhism was introduced to Japan by the king of Paekche in the middle of the 6th century. But we're also very interested in what's happening in Shilla. And I think perhaps that would be there are 2 sets of landscapes there that I'd love to explore some more. And of course, we've got this amazing glass from so many of the, this was a photograph that I think I took today in the National Museum. Blue glass. We find the same blue glass in sites right at the other end of Eurasia. In Sweden, our site is Gamla Uppsala, which is the great ceremonial, the burial site with many, many burial mounds from the Viking and pre-Viking period. There's a nice earlier, it's a 19th century print, I think, showing how the church has arrived and plonked itself right in the middle of this pagan burial. So the appropriation, one of our themes, I said, is about encounters. We're very interested in the ways in which pre-existing belief systems and sets of rituals are incorporated or appropriated by both Buddhism and Christianity. To give you one example, in Norwich Cathedral, very famous for its ceiling bosses. We have over 900 ceiling bosses telling the whole story of the Bible. And in there's a green man, one of these sort of nature spirits peeping out behind, from nothing to do with Christianity, but a lot to do with religions that would have been undertaken before that. And of course, it's close to this site, the Helyor Buddha. His Gamla Uppsala just up there, the Helyor Buddha was discovered. So trying to understand how this is all working is of great interest. And the silk, these discoveries of silk from especially the burial field at Valsgårda in Sweden, which is part of the same complex of sites. So it's very exciting for us to be working with our colleagues in Uppsala and Sweden. And then another site is Jelling, which is one of my favorite examples, I suppose, partly because they've got such great names. This is King Gorm, and it's Harold the Blue Tooth. Yes, we get this all right, hopefully. And there are tremendous rune stones here depicting this transformation from a non-Christian to a Christian context. And here we've got a crucifixion scene appearing on the rear of one of the rune stones there. And again, with the church, if you like, sort of the Christian church appropriating what was clearly a very important site for the rulers at that time. But as I say, we've probably got far too many ideas. We'd submitted a big research grant application to the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, and we were all surprised. Well, we were a bit horrified by the comments that came back, because they said, "What are you doing? This is insane what you're trying to do. You know, why this is far too broad a project." But I think we've certainly found that through the new international research network that we've been able to put together. So we've brought people who would never normally think of coming from Europe to Korea and Japan, introduced them not only to the sites and the museums, but for my money, most importantly, to the researchers who are doing such great work here, but work which is not adequately known outside the region. And I think it's exactly the same the other way around. We've been able to invite Professor Ree has been to Norwich and taken part in our conferences there, and to Istanbul. And we've been to invite other scholars from Korea and Japan as well to come to Europe to see what we're doing, to very much make sure that people understand what's happening, you know, the current state of thinking and the current priorities that researchers are working with. And at the end of this month, we're back for a week. We've been able to bring a little bit of Nara to Norwich. This is a temple called Hasedera in the southern part of Nara Prefecture. It's a Shingon Buddhist temple, a very beautiful temple. And it's particularly famous for, it has a very large image of Canon. I don't know who Canon is in Korean. That's the Japanese name. It's one of the Bosatsu, one of the Bodhisattvas. It's Guanyin in Chinese. It's in Sanskrit. And I was taken along there last September, just again, having spoken to some people about our project. And they said, oh, Simon, you have to come to Hasadera. They've got something they want to show you. 5 o'clock in the morning, along we went, did all the Buddhist stuff. And they said, yes, they'd spread this thing out in the hall. And they said, it's 16.5 meters high. And it was laying on the floor like this because they said, we don't have anywhere in our temple these days that's big enough to hang this thing. But we've heard from our Japanese friends that your institute has got a great big building right next to it, which surely has got high enough ceilings. They were talking about Norwich Cathedral, which does have high enough ceilings. And I thought, okay, it's a gold image of the Buddha. So I said, well, I'll ask the bishop and see what he says. Well, unfortunately, the bishop was not feeling particularly ecumenical that day. So he said, now that's going to be a bit of a challenge to have this in the cathedral. But so instead of that, we've been able to, just in the last week or so, we've been able to secure some funding to bring 12 of the priests from Hasadera, who are very famous for their chanting of the sutras. And they're going to come to Norwich with their 16.5 meter high image of the Canon Bodhisattva. And instead of Norwich Cathedral and those not so ecumenical Anglicans, we're going to be in the lovely secular surroundings of the Forum Library in Norwich. And we're going to be doing some chanting. We have a chanting workshop with our Buddhist monks and Norwich's very famous chanters of medieval plainsong. And we've got a professor from University of California in Santa Barbara coming, and he's going to be putting that workshop together for us. And I don't think anything like that has ever happened before. Never happened in Norwich, certainly. So we're very much looking forward to that. We'll have some of it online, and we'll make sure that we'll spread the word to say how that's all developing. So that's it. That was a little bit about our Nara to Norwich project. Huge thank you to Susan for presenting this work we're become very interested in on the Silk Roads. All sorts of things happening relating to the Silk Roads this year. There are 2 major exhibitions in London at the British Museum and the British Library on Silk Road themes. And we just hope that through some of our work, we've been talking to colleagues there, we've been able to perhaps stretch the Silk Road imaginary, I suppose, so that it does link up what's happening here in East Asia with what's happening at the other end of the continent. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Thank you. My name is Stephanie. I'm just for the first time. We're going to set you guys. Very proud. So have you been in the Hongju, Tomb of Muyeon, in 5th century?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So in fact, we were very lucky. We were taken there in 2019 by Professor Wu, Professor Jae-byung Wu of Chungnam National University. And in fact, yesterday, was it yesterday? No, the day before yesterday, we were able to go back. And we saw the brand new displays about the World Heritage Sites. And I think we were all really impressed, weren't we, by the way that that's being presented, the amount of detailed information that's there, the quality of the reconstructions. It's just such a beautiful spot on the mountainside there, looking out over the river and across to the fortress and everything. But again, I think perhaps too few people who aren't specialists in this period of Korean history know about this. And I think, for my money, the UNESCO World Heritage inscription is really very important for that. We're hoping that through our work, we can just get a few more people. I've actually bought a couple of tours of British archaeologists over to Korea to have a look around as well. And they've also been really interested to see that site. Wonderful, wonderful. Keep up the good work. And it's fantastic that it's in 4 different languages as well. There's really good English there, as well as Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. So we were very impressed.
Thank you very much for your informative lecture. I know that there are many Buddhists in Korea, and Buddhism in Korea are really China. And the first in Korea is the best in Korea. At early stage, Buddhism came to Korea, Buddhism came to China by way of the Seoul. And many Buddhists now from China. They traveled to India to study, to learn Buddhism and Sanskrit. And they translate Buddhist scripture and flourished for some time, but later declined at first. It may not be your specialty. I don't know why. And also you briefly, Professor Susan briefly mentioned about the contact between Persia and Korea, Shilala's unified kingdom Shilala in the essence, Persian people have to there. And the short refugee time, they first when they saw refugee kingdom. And have you noticed any influence, testing for influence in the other things of Shila kingdom? Persian influence or Middle East influence?
Well, of course, yes, thank you for that. This has been written about, the Buddhist monks traveling to India. Yes, we've done quite a lot on that. And in this exhibition, we have a section, in fact, on Rachel, who went off to India and probably as far as Persia and came back via Dunhuang, which is an area I know well because I curate manuscripts in Dunhuang and centrally in the British Library. And that's a very important part of the story, of course. There must have been thousands, if not tens of thousands of monks and possibly nuns who made those pilgrimages, and we have only a few of them, that we know about. So that was very important. The links with Persia, I mean, in that paper I mentioned, I talk about this. I talk about Korean scholars now starting to include this narrative in the narrative of Silk Road, Korea's links with Persia. I mean, I'm not a student of that area, so I haven't looked, but of course, many scholars now, or several scholars, are working on this, talking about potential links that Persia had on Korean world at that time. And I think, yeah, so probably the other way around as well. I just think it's the tip of the iceberg here. We have so little understanding. We all keep inside our own areas and think that people in the past didn't travel. In fact, we were talking to my colleague Neil earlier about whether Vikings ever got as far as East Anglia. Individuals probably did, because individuals travel, they go further. They don't necessarily leave a record, but there's always curious people who go further than we hear about. So yeah, yes, thanks for those questions. I think those are precisely the sort of questions we're exploring and hoping to. I mean, what this project is really to put people in touch with each other and raise questions and hope that they will, scholars then, network scholars will go out and start discussing them more fully, so that the scholarly landscape in this area will become more complex, and there'll be better networks of scholars to feed on each other's knowledge, rather than us doing all this scholarship ourselves, which we're not expert in. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for today.
Yeah.
You lectured to us that through Silk Road, ancient culture and textiles have circulated around the world, and Silk Road is not a single name. And as a Korean, I wonder that have the evidence that ancient Korean artifacts and textiles have spread to Europe. Discovered before?
As far as I know, we don't have evidence yet, but there's no reason why. Well, obviously there are reasons why not many would spread, but we don't have. I don't know of any evidence yet.
What was the question?
About whether there's Korean textiles in Europe from this period. But as we've seen from the Helio Buddha from the Swat Valley and Chinese silk found in graves in Sweden, I think there's that this is research really just starting, because for a long time people weren't open to the idea that goods can come from so far. And it's, as you say, when you're doing analysis of some of this silk now and some of the linen and the fabrics, and reanalysis is being done we're in a different scholarly space, if you like, and reanalysis of old finds is being done, and often might come out with new results because there's better scientific tests. So no, we haven't found any Korean silks that we know about yet in European context, but that's not to mean that there aren't any.
Through broadcasting a few years ago, I watched that the evidence that ancient Korean artifacts and textiles have been discovered in the ancient Italy. So,
oh, well, that's a new one for me. So I'll look that up. I don't know about that. Do you? No, but thank you. I'll look it up. It'd be interesting to see. But you know, why not? People were traveling the world like they do now.
Well, there's that 60-meter Buddhist tapestry that's in Norwich. That one.
Yeah, that one's in Japan at the moment, but it's coming to Norwich for our special exhibition. But
Yeah.
we do have the little bronze head, certainly. So yeah, things will move.
Also, it's we have a piece of silk in the British Library, which 3rd, 4th century from the desert of the Taklamakan, and scholars, both international silk experts, have looked at it, and none of them have been able to identify it. It's not unlike anything they've seen before, so it doesn't fit into any natural context. So I think it might be Indian, but that's just speculation on my part. So we've still got lots of stuff we haven't identified. We haven't got that data set of, you know, definite Korean silks and definite Chinese silks and definite Indian silks and that to match things again. So I think this is partially what I'm doing this project for, to try to build those networks so we start getting more expertise and think of new, fresh ways of looking at things rather than the old ways, assuming that all silk must come from China and all things like that. So yeah, maybe next time we come, but I will look up the Italian stuff. That's very interesting. Yeah.
I also have a question to Professor Whitfield. I'm a student, technical student from China, and this will definitely provides me with a new critical view for certain things I know. I definitely believe that there might be some demands with different reasons simultaneously to contribute to the success of the self-growth. But I'm wondering, like, does the demographic proportion could decide how much influence the countries could do to the self-growth, because the demand cannot decide the road and how much committedly.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Of course, a lot of the stuff we're talking about here is elite stuff. So it's not moving among the general population of a country. It's moving between the elites of the country, between the, you know, the king and the court and the very fine stuff. You know, that's, and so I would say for that, I mean, it's a question I can't give you an answer to because I haven't got an answer. I think it's an interesting thing, but I think a lot of the stuff we're looking at is to do with elites, and you have elites, even if you've got a small country, you might have quite a, you know, big elite, and all of whom want to compete with each other to have. It's astonishing in a way how much. I don't know whether you've read a book called The Royal Hunt. It's a very nice book because it shows how the royal hunt, hunting animals, all the forms, the practices of it, the ways that it was done, the clothes people wore, the weapons were shared across all these Silk Road ports. It was, I always say to people, if you go to visit President Trump, well, he's not President, ex-President Trump, if you take him to play golf, that was the elite sport of the time. You know, that's what you do. You play a game of golf to cement your friendship. And that time you had to do the royal hunt. And we have nice things from Tang Empress, for example, moaning about the expense of putting on huts for visiting delegations. But my point about that is, it's not really about the demographics of the countries, although a lot of these were large empires. Yeah, it's about the wealth of the elite and the power of that small elite.
Okay. Well, no, we have to finish. We only have 5 minutes, so we need to finish up, I'm afraid. We have to finish up. We need to be out of here in 5 minutes.
You
Sorry.
can ask me after, okay?
So, yeah, afterwards, are you free to join for a beer or something?
Yes.
So.
I know a place that has silkworm larvae we can eat.